Let's take a look at the object properties tied to each bone. In this scene, I have a standard leg rig. The geometry has been linked to each bone. If we'd like to go ahead and select the mesh, let's go ahead and right-click and get back to layers to unfreeze the mesh layer. We'll leave this unfrozen for now, just to take a look at a few options under our object properties rollout. Let's head over to animation and grab our bone tools. We'll scroll down until we find our object properties. So this is what we'd use to either convert objects to bone objects, or we can use this to instantly set up squash and stretch, which we'll take a look at. And if a bone needs to be realigned to point at its child object, we can also use the features here to correct those types of issues. Alright, so let's go ahead and get started now. If we were to go ahead and select our thigh bone, you can see that at the top, bone on is automatically on because this is a bone object. However, if we were to go ahead and select our thigh geometry, that's not the case. But watch this, we can instantly convert this to a bone by simply enabling this option. Now watch, if we were to go to our move tool and start to move this thigh geometry, notice the entire system follows. So very easily we can convert these objects to bones and have them function the same way, which is a very exciting tool. I'm going to go ahead and now disable that on the thigh geometry to bring everything back to default here. So we can get back to the control we had prior to that. Now with the thigh bone selected, let's go in and now take a look at the next option we have, freeze length. So with this on, if we were to go in and select the shin and start to move this around, what you'll see is that we cannot stretch this bone object at all. Its length is staying locked. If we were to go in and disable freeze length on the thigh, let's go ahead and select that bone and disable that and go back to the shin. What you'll see now is that we get squash and stretch just in one axis, but still that's really neat how fast we're able to set this up. You could also see that the geometry parented to the bone object does not stretch at all. That's simply because it has been parented and not skinned. If we were to skin this geometry, then we would most certainly see the geometry stretch as the bone stretches. So that's really cool. Now what about volume in this bone? How come we can't see that? Well, that's simply because of our stretch option. Right now it's set to scale. Let's go ahead and undo this back. I'll hide the mesh. Let's go back to our thigh bone and let's go ahead and set our stretch type to squash. Now, if we were to go back to our shin, you could start to see the squash and stretch behavior. Really cool. Now, how about the axis that we squash and stretch in? What determines that? Well, that's the axis setting here. So by default, it's going to be the x-axis. If we were to switch this to, let's say, y, no longer are we going to see squash and stretch as we pull the shin. So I'll go back to the thigh and set this to y, grab the shin, and start to pull this. Take a look. No longer do we see squash and stretch because we have changed the stretch axis. Pretty straightforward. And then we could go ahead and switch those settings around by using flip. So if we were to go back to X and choose flip, when we start to pull, that's essentially just a way to kind of flip the direction of the squash and stretch. But chances are, again, you're going to want to leave this set to the default settings, except for, of course, squash. You'll want to go ahead and make sure that that is enabled. Now, something very important else that I'd like to point out is correct negative stretch. So if we ever get into some trouble where we're running into negative values as we squash and stretch, which can run into skewing, other issues like that, we could just make sure that correct negative stretch is on so we don't have to ever worry about those problems. Alright, so since it's on by default, it might be a good idea to leave that on. Now the next options that we'll take a look at are our realignment tools. And what I'd like to do, just to make sure that we don't interfere with the geometry, so it doesn't shift, let's go ahead and go to our side view and we'll create a brand new bone system to experiment with. Alright, so I'll just go in and create a quick bone system here. And now we can go ahead and move back to the perspective view. Alright, so let's take a look. Right now, if we were to go ahead and select this main root and turn off auto align, notice what happens when we go to the nub. Now, our bone object is not going to point at the nub at all. If we need to, we can always realign this bone object by simply selecting it and choosing realign. That takes us part of the way there, but notice there's still a gap. So if we would like to attach the two together, it'd just be a matter of using reset stretch. Now it pops that bone object back so it follows the length. Chances are you're going to want to keep auto align on. And we can see clearly why that is. Another thing I'd like to point out to you is if you ever ran into some issues where as you squash and stretch you have a bit of skewing, that's simply because you haven't reset the scale on your bone object. So if you have some offset values in your scale, what you could do is use reset scale to convert each value back to 100%. So it's essentially resetting the scale transform data so that we can avoid those skewing issues. Alright, so those are our object properties, and we saw how useful they are. When we start to create a custom muscle, we'll most certainly work with our squash and stretch features here so that we can have the muscle behave naturally, and we can start to see some really cool results when we start to add weight to that influence and add more realism to our deformations. Alright, so that's it for this lesson. In the next lesson, we'll start to get into inverse kinematics.